Hello, I'm Vanessa Ferdinand. I'm doing a postdoc in computational cognitive science at the University of Melbourne with Amy Purfors. I work on the mechanisms of inheritance in the evolution of culture, and today I'll be talking about the evolution of category systems within and between learners. Say you're interested in the evolution of life on Earth. If you want to understand the mechanisms of biological inheritance, what should you do? Well, you should do molecular biology and research DNA. But say you're interested in the evolution of culture. If you want to understand how the mechanisms of cultural inheritance work, what should you do here? Well, I think you should do cognitive science and research how information gets transmitted from one brain to another brain via cultural artifacts, or one artifact to another artifact by a cognitive system. Cultural inheritance is an interesting computational problem that always involves some kind of a cognitive system. It could be human, animal, AI, or whatever. So what are cool questions in cultural evolution that cognitive scientists can work on? Here's a good one: cumulative cultural evolution. This is a process that creates behaviors and technology that no single human individual could invent on their own. It means that cultural transmission, and not individual learning, has the ability to create artifacts that are well adapted for what humans use them for. Like hammers are well adapted to driving nails, and languages are well adapted to communication. Nearly all experiments in cumulative cultural evolution contrast two conditions like this. The first condition is a transmission chain, where each participant learns from the behavior of a previous participant. And in the other condition, one individual works on the same task by themselves. These experiments tend to find that the cultural condition produces more complex or more efficient artifacts than the individual condition does. But that could be because objectively more time and more work has gone into the artifact in the cultural condition. This isn't really fair from the point of view of the artifact, because we've given one of them more time to evolve. When something's evolving, each transmission event is an opportunity for an artifact to gain information about its environment. So we want to keep the number of opportunities the same across conditions and control for evolutionary time. Then we're in a better position to ask, is there still a secret sauce to cultural transmission, and what is it? I'm going to describe an experiment on the evolution of category systems that controls for evolutionary time. And I want to know, do these systems differ in the way that they explore cultural evolutionary space? So on to the experiment. Here's our experimental design. Participants learned how to categorize shells on an alien planet. There were 10 stimuli that varied on one dimension and 2 labels that could apply to each stimulus. When you put these together, you get a category system. Here's one example system where labels A and B divide the stimuli into 2 categories. Each participant was trained on one category system. They would see a stimulus, choose a label for it, and then receive feedback with the correct label. Then we tested them once per stimulus without feedback to obtain a new category system. So the input system was what they were trained on, and the output system is what they produced when testing. In the cultural condition, a participant is trained on a category system and then tested on it. Then the testing set of that participant becomes the training set for the next participant, and so on. In the individual condition, each participant did several rounds of training and testing. In each round, they were trained on the same system from their last testing set. They were not told they'd be trained on their own responses, and they didn't seem to notice this either. We ran this experiment on Google App Engine with recruitment from Mechanical Turk. Participants were located in the US, and everyone was paid above federal minimum wage. We had 207 cultural participants organized into 45 transmission chains, and 90 individual participants in 90 chains. We had to initialize each of these chains with a category system. So each chain was initialized with a different random mapping of labels to stimuli, but they all had 5 of each label. Here are some examples of different initial category systems. Also, how did we end each chain? Well, we ran them till convergence. When a participant perfectly reproduced their training set, we said the chain had converged and we ended it. But in the individual condition, if they were still going after 8 rounds, we ended the experiment then, for humanitarian reasons. We didn't know how fast these chains would converge, but we found that the rates were similar in both conditions, and the longest chain went for 11 generations. In the individual condition, about 85% of the chains converged before we cut them off at the 8th round. Here's an example lineage from each condition. On the left is an individual chain that converged on the 8th round, but let's call that the 8th iteration. And on the right is a cultural chain that converged on the 7th participant, but we can also call that the 7th iteration. And this is cool because it kind of looks like one of those old school cellular automata. Anyway, what we got out of this experiment was 642 category systems to analyze. So how do the two transmission regimes explore the space of possible category systems? Before we answer that, we need to know what is the space of all possible category systems. This space is small by design. There were 2 to the 10 possible category systems because there were 10 stimuli that could take one of 2 labels. And we can coarse grain these systems by their number of category boundaries into 10 bins, ranging from 0 boundaries at the minimum to 9 boundaries at the maximum. So if we have k category boundaries, this is the distribution we would expect to see if participants were randomly answering during the testing phase of the experiment. So this is a reasonable baseline that we can compare participants' responses to. So what systems did evolution explore? Compared to the baseline of random guessing, participants in the individual condition spent much more time exploring systems with fewer category boundaries. And in the cultural condition, this trend was even stronger. However, not a single participant ever used one label for all 10 stimuli. So these category systems didn't degenerate. They stayed simple but useful. Overall, there was a significant effect of condition on the number of category boundaries, with individuals exploring higher complexity systems than cultural chains. We can also ask, what systems did evolution converge on? Above is all the systems that participants produced during the entire experiment. But now let's look at evolution's endpoints only, because you can get to the same place in 2 different ways, right? So we found that the same relationship holds here too. Individuals converged on significantly more complex systems than cultural chains did. So in both cases, we did find a difference between conditions, even when controlling for evolutionary time. I'll come back to this result at the end of the talk, but first, let me tell you a little bit more about evolution as an exploratory process. There are 2 main ways of conceptualizing evolution, as an optimization process or as a creative process. In the first case, we're asking, did evolution find the best answer? And in the second case, we're asking, what answers did it find? A lot more work has been done using the optimization framework, so our computational toolkit to deal with the creative process is smaller. But remember, Darwin didn't write on the optimization of species. Understanding evolution as a creative and an exploratory process is just as enlightening. So here's something I came up with to help quantify evolution as a creative process that focuses on freedom of choice under constraints. The idea is based on Shannon's calculation of the entropy of English. If you were sitting down to write a sequence of letters in English, and if every letter you wrote perfectly predicted the next letter you'd write, then that sequence would have 0 entropy. It would be completely predictable. On the flip side, if every letter you wrote was an unconstrained random choice among the 26 letters in English and the space symbol, then that sequence would have maximum entropy, or the maximum amount of disorder possible in English. Shannon found that the entropy of actual sentences in English was somewhere in the middle, around 2.3 bits. Then he looked at this ratio, and he described it in a very interesting way. He described the blue part here as the freedom of choice that we have when we sit down to write a valid sentence in English. And then there's the negative space of that freedom, which are all of the constraints that this weird, unknowable grammar of English places on us. And that's the cool part. This framework gives us a way to quantify all of the constraints on a creative process without actually knowing what they are. So if we apply this framework to the evolutionary search we witnessed in our experiment, we can compare the entropy of these distributions to the baseline to see how strongly these conditions were constrained above and beyond random behavior. Here's the picture we got. This is the entropy of each distribution, and these are the 95% confidence intervals. We had a different number of observations in each condition, so we estimated the entropy with the minimax method, which corrects for the number of observations. And we calculated the 95% confidence intervals by resampling our data with the bootstrap method. Because these confidence intervals do not overlap, we can infer that these two conditions really are subject to different evolutionary constraints. Here are those ratios of evolutionary constraints to exploratory freedom. On the right, we see that a group of individual transmission chains is more exploratory than a group of cultural transmission chains. So cultural transmission places more constraints on the evolutionary search process. So here's the next natural question to ask. What are these constraints? When we look at these two conditions, we see there are several cognitive differences between them. One is memory. Participants in the cultural condition only know what the category system looked like on their iteration, whereas participants in the individual condition have access to memory that spans the entire history of the category system. Individuals also gain more experience with the task over time and may be affected by increasing fatigue or loss of attention. Finally, there's more diversity in a cultural transmission chain than in an individual transmission chain. Each learner may have different learning biases or priors, and this extra diversity could affect the dynamics of evolutionary search. There are a variety of cognitive factors that could modulate the dynamics of cultural evolution. In future research, we should be able to manipulate each of these and then quantify its effect as a constraint on cultural evolution. We're currently working on this in the case of memory limitations, and I'd like to show you some preliminary results. So, what is the effect of different memory windows on evolutionary search? We took a widely used and general model of categorization, the generalized context model, and set it up to work with the same category learning task we gave to our participants. Then we added a computational constraint, which was exponential decay of memories over time. So agents with higher decay were more likely to forget training trials that occurred early on in the experiment. We compared two types of agents, those with decaying memory and those with perfect memory. We put all of these agents into individual transmission chains and looked to see if the forgetting condition led to a restricted evolutionary search, just like we saw in the cultural condition. I'm not sure how robust this result is, but we did find lots of examples where the forgetters explored a significantly smaller space of category systems than agents with perfect memory did. Overall, this is an example of how adding a computational constraint at the micro level of cognition leads to a macro level constraint on the evolution of category systems. We're also looking into learning bias diversity so that we can understand what happens to cultural evolution when its learners are diverse, or at least not clones of each other. It seems like a higher diversity of learners might lead to a wider evolutionary search. But in our experiment, we saw the opposite. Participants in the cultural condition were the ones who explored fewer category systems. So what's going on here? Well, our intuition is this. When learners are not connected together by cultural transmission, they're able to explore all the nuances of their own ideas. But when they are connected, learners might be forced to explore the intersection of those ideas. So whatever's more likely to be in that intersection will be overrepresented in culture. And if simpler explanations are more likely to be there, then that may explain our results, where the cultural condition was best at finding those simple systems with very few category boundaries. So what does this all mean for cumulative cultural evolution? First, we show that the evolutionary dynamics of individual learning and cultural transmission are different, even after controlling for evolutionary time. So yes, there is some secret sauce, but it was the individuals who achieved more complex artifacts, not culture. This is also the case in recent work showing that smaller groups evolve more complex languages. And this was done in a laboratory setting where they also controlled for the number of transmission events across group sizes. And last, cultural transmission achieved more efficient artifacts, namely the simple yet expressive one-boundary category systems. This is in line with other recent work on the evolution of category systems, and these papers explore this efficiency point in much more detail. Thank you very much for listening, and please email me so we can talk. Bye.